Hey guys, tonight we're pulling you into a world where dawn doesn't break with birdsong. It explodes with the echo of distant artillery, where the first thing you hear isn't a rooster's crow, but the dull thud of mortar landing in the yaw. Next valley over, you're not in a soldier's uniform. You're not behind a gun. You're just here. A farmer, a mother, a kid, and the Vietnam. War is happening whether you want it or not. But it's the early morning in a quiet hamlet somewhere between Huck and Quang Tro. The sun isn't even up yet, but your eyes are wide open. You didn't sleep well. You never really do anymore. You used to wake to the smell of wet earth and the gentle splash of oxen stepping into the rice paddies. Now, you wake because something shook the walls of your bamboo hut. Again, there's no running water. Your kitchen is a clay hearth that still has ash from last night's dinner, just a small ball of rice and half a dried fish. You glance at your children, still asleep on a mat in the corner. You envy them, but not really. Even in sleep, one of them's clutching a ragged teddy bear like it's armor. That bear's missing an eye. So is the child who used to live 2 doors down. As you step outside, the air carries something bitter, burnt, acrid. You can't see it, but you know what it is. Something fell from the sky a few kilometers away. Maybe napalm. Maybe something worse. You hope the wind shifts. There's no such thing as a day off. War doesn't pause just because your hands are blistered or your legs ache from squatting in the mud. You picked your way across a trail pocked with shell craters, heading toward the field. You pass by what's left of a cart half buried in a ditch, rusted, blood-stained. Flies don't care who died in it. You try not to. And yet, life goes on. You reach your small patch of land. The rice paddies are shallow pools reflecting the morning haze. The water looks peaceful, but below that mirror surface, that's where your neighbor found a body last week. Just floated up. No ID. Just 1 foot gone. Probably stepped where he shouldn't have. Still, you get to work. Pull weeds. Set the seedlings. Watch the sky. Always watching the sky. Because one moment you're here, and the next, the ground might erupt like thunder from nowhere. It's happened. It'll happen. Again. Back home, your youngest is coughing again. The air hasn't been right since the planes came through last month. She used to sing while she swept the yard. Now, she barely speaks. Her eyes always seem to be looking towards something behind you. You go to fetch water. The well is deeper. Now bombing collapsed the old one. While pulling the bucket up, you hear a noise you know too well. The rapid pop-pop-pop of distant gunfire. Not close enough to panic, but close enough to remind you. You hurry back. Your neighbor tells you the Americans passed through last night. Again, they came looking for VC, left with a few boys who may or may not have known anything. One of them was 17. He taught your daughter how to read. But here's the part people never think about. It's not just fear. It's not just hunger. It's the exhaustion that seeps into your bones like damp air. You stop flinching at gunfire. You stop crying when someone doesn't come home. Not because you're brave, but because your heart's already too tired to break again. You remember a time barely when you believed in things. A country, a flag, even a future. Now you believe. In little things, like a dry blanket, a full stomach, a night without flares lighting up the sky, and still the roosters crow. Late, always, like they too are afraid of drawing attention, like they know the jungle is watching. But how did this even start? How did regular people, shopkeepers, farmers, monks, end up in a place where silence is scarier than explosions? 2. Find that out. We've got to go deep into the green heart of Vietnam, where the jungle wasn't just a backdrop, was a monster in its own right. Step off the path. just 3 feet into the underbrush. That's all it takes for the world to change completely. Suddenly, it's not just heat you feel, it's a weight. The air itself presses against your skin like a wet cloth. Every inch of your body starts to prickle. It's not paranoia. Something is watching you. Maybe it's an animal. Maybe it's something worse. The Vietnamese jungle wasn't just terrain. It was a creature. Ancient, silent, and hungry. It swallowed soldiers. It swallowed villages. And it never gave them back the same way. The canopy above you is so thick, you can barely tell what time it is. Shadows pile on top of shadows. Everything is green. Every leaf, every vine, every lichen-coated rock. But you don't touch anything, not even the trees, because one wrong brush with a camouflaged vine might slice your skin open. And something dripping from that tree might not be rain, it might be snake venom. Or worse. The jungle didn't care if you were American or Viet Cong, Northern or Southern. It punished everyone equally. People talk about war like it happens in open fields or city streets. But here, entire battalions vanished into this greenery. Not from gunfire, but from disease, insects, dehydration, and the feeling that the jungle itself didn't want them there. You could die from the heat or from the cold that came when the rains hit at night. Either way, no one would find your body, because the vines would grow over you in days. The ants would take what they could, and the mud would do the rest. And if you were a local, you knew not to take shortcuts. You knew not to step off the raised walkways, even if they were rotting, because your father taught you where the landmines were hidden. Because you remembered where the Americans cleared the land with bulldozers, and where the Viet Cong laid fresh traps afterward. And even then, the jungle shifted. The landmarks changed. One wrong turn, and suddenly the trail you've walked every day for years is gone. Eaten by creeping undergrowth. There were entire villages inside the jungle. Tunnels dug deep below root systems. Homes made from scrap and mud, lit by oil lamps and hope. Babies were born there. Grandparents died there. Some of these communities lasted years without being seen by anyone who didn't already know the way in. And even they got lost sometimes. If you were a kid in one of these villages, the jungle was your school, your playground, and your prison. You'd learn how to spot tiger tracks, how to listen for the rustle of bamboo before it snaps, how to dig a hiding hole so deep even a helicopter flying directly above wouldn't see the lid of leaves and dirt you'd placed over yourself. You'd hear stories, whispered at night, about the jungle spirits, the old ghosts who wandered the trees, not the ones from legend, but the ones wearing uniforms, carrying rifles, the ones who never made it home. You believed they were still out there, and honestly, maybe they were. For soldiers, especially the Americans, the jungle was the ultimate enemy. It blurred all lines. It was loud with insects, but silent with threats. A path might suddenly vanish under a landslide. A clearing could conceal a spike pit. A rustle in the bushes might be a monkey. Or it might be a sniper, 20 feet up, motionless. For hours. But here's the twist: the Viet Cong thrived here. They were the jungle. They moved through it like water through a stream, setting ambushes, laying traps, disappearing before you even knew they were there. Some didn't wear shoes, not out of poverty, but for silence. Their feet hardened like leather. Their sense of direction was instinctual. They didn't need maps. They were the map. And sometimes, just sometimes, you'd find something worse. Then gunfire. There were stories of villagers coming across a U.S. patrol, or what was left of it. Weapons abandoned, helmets scattered, a line of bodies, eyes wide, skin blistered, and red not from bullets, but from something that soaked into the leaves and crept into the blood. Sometimes it was napalm. Sometimes it was Agent Orange. But Sometimes it was just fear. Raw, sour fear that had nowhere else to go. Because when you live in the jungle, you don't walk. You tiptoe. You don't breathe too loud. You never travel alone. And you never, ever follow the bird song. Because sometimes the birds are gone and what's mimicking them isn't trying to be friendly. But as terrifying as it was, the jungle wasn't just horror. It also kept people alive. It provided roots and herbs when medicine ran out. It gave hiding places for the hunted. It listened when no one else did. And when the war ended, it became the final witness. Still, watchful, and full of ghosts. But if you think the jungle was cruel, wait until you see what happened in the rice fields, where you could go out one morning with a hoe and come back dragging someone who stepped wrong. You're standing knee-deep in water. The sun's just come up, but you're already soaked, not from sweat, not from effort, just from being. Because that's what rice farming is. You exist in it. You don't walk across the paddies, you wade, slowly, carefully. Each step could be your last. This was supposed to be the safest job. You weren't a soldier. You weren't a scout. You weren't on anybody's list. You just grew rice. That's it. But in Vietnam during the war, nothing was that simple. Not even the soil under your feet. Most farmers knew their land by heart. Where the good irrigation channels ran, where the dikes were weakest, which patches had leeches worse than others. But what they couldn't know was where the landmines had been laid, especially the ones no one ever came back to mark. Some were American-made, others were Soviet. Some were cobbled together from Coke cans and broken mortar shells. You'd hear stories. A child walking barefoot to help her mother plant seedlings gone in a flash. Just gone. Or a man who stepped on something, heard a click, and just stood there for hours. Until someone brave or desperate came with a stick and a prayer, that it didn't matter who planted them. ARVN, Viet Cong, Americans, French decades earlier once. Those explosives were in the ground. The earth didn't care about your politics. It just waited. Here's what makes it worse. During monsoon season, the rivers swell and the soil shifts. Mines move. A weapon buried last year on the edge of a trail might slide 50 feet into your field overnight. So even if you'd walked a path 100 times before, you could still lose a foot on the 101st dot. And then there were the unexploded bombs. The ordnance that didn't go off when it was supposed to. It just sank, humming silently beneath the mud, waiting. The kids sometimes called them sleeping turtles. Harmless, unless you poked them, unless your plow hit one, unless your son tripped on a vine and landed just a little too hard in the wrong spot. But rice still had to be grown. War didn't stop mouths from being hungry, so families went out anyway. Whole families, children included. A toddler balanced on his brother's back. A girl with her hair tied in a rag because they couldn't afford ribbons anymore. No shoes, just ankles caked in wet earth. They moved through the paddies like ghosts, heads down, eyes scanning every ripple in the water. Some carried long sticks, not for planting, for poking, gently, every few steps. Just in case. And if you think this was rare, think again. Vietnam is a long, narrow country, and nearly all of it was touched by war. Fields weren't battlefields because people fought there. They became battlefields because someone might have hidden something there. The paranoia was the point. It kept you terrified. It kept you obedient. You didn't need to see soldiers to feel the war. Still, rice was life. Without it, people starved. Villages depended on it, even as it turned against them. The same paddies that fed them also swallowed them. Sometimes you'd be lucky enough to harvest a full crop. You'd load, get into sacks, dry it on woven mats, and store it in thatched silos. But even then, the war could take it. Raiding soldiers both north and south would seize the grain for their own troops. Requisition, they called it, as if calling it that made it any less of a robbery dot. So families began hiding rice underground, in jars, in sealed pots beneath their floors, in tree trunks hollowed out for safekeeping. But that had its own risks. If soldiers found it, they'd punish everyone. Call you traitors, collaborators, starvers of the revolution. And yet, in the middle of all this, there was a kind of brutal normalcy. People still told jokes in the fields, still shared sugarcane between shifts, still teased one another about falling face first in the mud dot, because if you didn't laugh, what else was there? Some women would carry radios in their conical hats, hidden, under cloth to catch news from Hanoi or Saigon. Sometimes the signal was too weak. Sometimes the news was worse than the silence. But hearing it, even for a moment, made them feel connected to something beyond these waterlogged rows of green dot. And here's the most surreal part. After a day of stepping through rice paddies that could explode, people still knelt down to pray. Right there in the mud, with their knees in the same soil that held hidden death. They bowed their heads and whispered thanks for surviving another day. But the war didn't just hide in the ground. It crept into the minds of the next generation children who didn't know a life without explosions, sirens, and helicopters. We're about to step into that world, into the eyes of the children, whose games were shaped by shrapnel, and whose lullabies were interrupted by gunfire. In a country split by bullets and ideology, childhood didn't survive. Not really. You're 6 years old, but you've never seen a toy store, never eaten candy that didn't come from a soldier's pocket. You've never ridden a bicycle. But you know exactly what an M16 sounds like. You can tell the difference between incoming mortar and outgoing artillery just by the echo dot in wartime Vietnam. Being a child didn't mean you were safe. It meant you were small, fast, and sometimes useful. But mostly, it meant you were vulnerable. You played in dirt, but not too deep, because you might find something shiny, something smooth and egg-shaped. You might reach for it, thinking it's treasure. But it wasn't. It was a cluster bomb fragment. And if it hadn't already gone off, it could go off in your hand. You knew kids who lost their fingers like that. Others lost legs, eyes. You stopped asking what happened when someone came back wrapped in bandages. You knew what happened. The war happened, and yet kids still played. Because what else could they do? In villages, children turned empty bullet casings into toys. They'd string them together and pretend they were snakes, or tap them like drums. Little brass reminders of yesterday's firefight, now part of a game. You'd see boys with sticks pretending to shoot down helicopters. You'd see girls tracing the shapes of American planes in the sky, naming them like constellations. But the war always interrupted. Always. Some kids were conscripted. Yes, even children. Especially in the North. If you were 10 or 11 and healthy, someone might hand you a satchel and whisper, "Run this across the field. Don't stop." You didn't know what was inside. Ammunition? Leaflets? Medicine? You just ran. You were small. Harder to hit. Sometimes that was enough. Sometimes it wasn't. You'd hear stories. A boy taken to a re-education camp because his father was suspected of helping the wrong side. A girl shot because she ran at the wrong time, in the wrong direction. Her dress fluttering behind her like a flag no one saluted. Some children lived in cities far from the front. But far didn't mean safe dot in Saigon. The streets were chaos. Rickshaws and jeeps. Vendors yelling over the roar of American motorcycles. On one corner, a boy sells stolen pens to G's. On the next, another's wiping windshields for coins. And just around the bend, a child no older than 5, lying still. Under a sheet, no one claiming him. Another casualty. Another silence. Hospitals were overrun. Clinics often had no anesthesia. When kids got hurt, they learned what pain really was. If you were lucky, you'd get stitched up on a wooden bench. If not, you'd wait and wait until infection did what the bullet didn't. But children adapted. They became lookouts, messengers, even fighters. And those who didn't, they still carried the war inside them. You could see it in their drawings houses on fire, men with guns, airplanes dropping teardrop shapes that weren't tears at all. You'd see it in how they jumped at thunder, how they flinched when a motorcycle backfired, how they didn't speak of dreams, because dreams required imagining something other than the world they knew. And then there were the shrapnel scars, deep ridges along a jaw, a twisted leg that never healed right, a hand missing 2 fingers. Some kids wore them like badges. Others hid them beneath long sleeves. Even in the heat, you might pass a group of children playing by the river and not realize one of them can't hear. Another can't speak. Another hasn't spoken since the raid that took her mother. Yet somehow, they laughed, a strange, defiant kind of laughter. The kind that says, "You haven't beaten me." Yet, and even stranger, they sang. Songs taught by parents and grandparents. Folk songs, lullabies, resistance chants. Whispered or shouted, depending on who was nearby. Because even if the country was broken in half, even if bombs fell like rain, the music stayed. But that music had a cost. Sometimes soldiers would hear, singing from a house, and assume it was code. They'd break down the door. Rough hands, loud commands, a family on their knees. A song that would never be sung again. It didn't matter which side they were on. Children were always caught in the middle, and often they were the first to suffer and the last to be remembered, because war doesn't end when the shooting stops. For the kids of Vietnam, it lived on in their bodies, in their memories, in their nervous twitches, in their nightmares. Some of them would grow up never knowing a single year of peace. Others wouldn't grow up at all. But how did they make sense of it when truth was so slippery and the people around them seemed to believe different versions of the same story? To understand that, we have to look at the strange world of radios, rumors, and the endless war of information that turned every village into a battlefield of the mind. You never really knew what was true. In a war like this, bullets were only half the battle. The rest was fought in the air through leaflets, loudspeakers, and tiny tinny radios humming in the corners of darkened homes. Truth became slippery. Facts bent like bamboo. And trust? That was the first casualty. Let's say you're a father living in a rural village, trying to keep your head down. You've got 3 kids, a wife, and a patch of land that's barely surviving. One day, an American helicopter hovers low and drops a rain of white paper propaganda leaflets, promising safety, democracy, and protection. The next day, a young man from the North Vietnamese army walks into your village and hands out his own flyers, denouncing the South's corruption, calling the Americans invaders, and reminding everyone who their real brothers are. Who? Do you believe? If you're smart, you pretend to believe both, depending on who's asking. That's how most people survived, not by picking a side, by playing them off each other, outwardly agreeable, inwardly terrified, and always listening, because everyone was listening. Radios were your lifeline. In some homes, old French or Soviet, radios squatted in corners like toads, their dials worn smooth from use. You'd crouch next to one, turning the knob with shaking fingers, trying to catch a signal through the static. Hanoi Radio, Voice of America, BBC Vietnamese, they all bled into each other, voices over voices. One day they said victory was near. The next, they warned of betrayal. Always confident, always contradictory. Sometimes you'd hear that a province had fallen. Then, weeks later, the same province was liberated, again by the other side. Words like won, secured, saved, they meant nothing anymore. Every story had a mirror version told by someone else, each just as certain as the last. But not all of it came from radios. Villages had their own news. Networks, older women who passed word like it was scripture. A cousin in Da Nang saw a U convoy retreating. A brother in Saigon said the government was collapsing. A neighbor's nephew claimed the Viet Cong were regrouping near the next town over. These weren't rumors. They were survival tools. You listened. You nodded. You adjusted your plans accordingly. And sometimes, the most dangerous messages weren't spoken at all, not at night. You'd hear broadcasts echoing through the trees' portable speakers, slung high in the branches, blasting messages from the Viet Cong. Promises, threats, warnings. A woman's voice, soft and eerie, telling American soldiers to go home, that their girlfriends were cheating, their government was lying, their death was inevitable. It was psychological warfare, and it wasn't just aimed at the GIS. Locals heard it too. And even if you didn't believe it, you couldn't unhear it. Of course, the South had its own tricks. Psychological operations dropped leaflets designed to look like official North Vietnamese orders, hoping they'd confuse or demoralize soldiers. Sometimes they'd promise amnesty to defectors. Sometimes they'd paint the North as brainwashing monsters. You couldn't trust any scrap of paper you found. Even music wasn't safe. Some songs were banned. Others were rewritten. A love ballad might suddenly become a nationalist anthem with a few words changed. Singing the wrong version in the wrong company could get you arrested or worse. But people sang anyway, quietly, under their breath, in cellars, in fields, in code. And then there were the spies. Everyone suspected someone. Your neighbors. Son went away for a year maybe. He was training with the communists. The man who sells fish at the market always seems to have extra. Maybe he's getting favors from the ARVN. A girl gets seen talking to an American soldier too long. Maybe she's working for the CIA. No one knew for sure. So everyone watched everyone else. Some families split in half. One son fought for the North. Another stayed loyal to the South. Parents lied to their children just to keep them safe. Siblings stopped speaking. Not out of hate, but fear. Because one wrong word at dinner could end up in a report. One careless opinion could reach the wrong ears. And still, life had to go on. People told themselves stories just to get through the day. They believed what made them feel safest. Or sometimes, they believed nothing. They kept their heads down and their mouths shut. But that didn't always work. Sometimes, propaganda came with real consequences. A leaflet might accuse your village of harboring enemies. Days later, bombs would fall. Homes would burn. People would vanish. All because of whispers. In this world, information was a weapon. Not just rifles and grenades, but ideas. Ideas that could make you brave or paranoid. Or dead. And nowhere was this more visible than in the cities, especially Saigon, where polished storefronts, Western bars, and fashion models stood side by side with beggars, black marketeers, and undercover agents. Because if the countryside was the war's heart, then the cities were its mirror, glamorous on the surface, but cracked all the way through. You step out of a taxi and into another world. Neon signs buzz overhead in red and blue. French colonial buildings loom with chipped elegance. The air smells like gasoline, fish sauce, cigarette smoke, and cheap perfume. And over it all, like static on a radio, there's tension. Unspoken, thick. Saigon isn't a city. It's a performance, held together with smiles and submachine guns. To a Western eye, it looks like a party. American G's line up outside nightclubs with names like the Doll House or Chinatown Rose. Girls in Odai walk by, graceful and unreadable. Cyclo drivers jostle for tourists. Radio towers blink in the distance as sidewalk cafes still serve baguettes. Jazz spills out of bars, mixing with the beat of distant helicopters. But listen closer. Behind the laughter, there's a siren. Behind the club music, a muffled explosion. Somewhere, someone just vanished. Again, this is what life in wartime Saigon felt like. Alive, stylish, hollow, and deadly. If you were lucky, you had an apartment near Rue Cadenat. You wore silk, drank filtered water, and listened to both Beatles records and BBC News. You had access to ration coupons, and maybe even American canned food spam, condensed milk, powdered eggs. You read the paper every morning and knew how to smile like you weren't scared. But just a few blocks away, the world shifted. Entire neighborhoods had no electricity, no running water, and no police who actually responded to anything. The streets there belonged to someone else's gangs. Malicious informants. People whispered about the 5 tigers, the black market kings, and mysterious men in suits who didn't blink when holding pistols. Children hustled. Some sold gum and lottery tickets. Others carried messages they didn't understand. For men they never named. You could get anything in Saigon if you knew where to look. A rifle, a forged document, a bottle of Johnny Walker, a one-way trip to Bangkok, or a one-way trip to the river if you crossed the wrong person. Even the rich weren't safe. One night, a general might host a dinner party wine, laughter, roasted duck. The next morning, his car explodes outside a church. His maid survives. His daughter doesn't. Rumors swirl, but no one speaks. Because in Saigon, you never knew who was listening. American soldiers swarmed the streets. Some looking for action, some just looking to escape. They filled the bars, danced with hostesses, handed out Hershey's to street kids. But even they weren't immune. Geese were targeted by bombings, ambushes, and honey traps. 1 minute there, flirting with a girl over drinks. The next, blackout, wallet gone, or worse. And yet, despite the danger, life didn't stop. It accelerated. People partied harder, wore brighter colors, threw bigger weddings. They acted like death couldn't touch them if they just moved fast enough. There was a sense that the city might be taken tomorrow, so you had to live today. Saigon became a city of illusions, laughter with a gun to its head. And beneath the glitz, there was grief. Women in black silk stood on corners selling incense. For lost sons, monks chanted near bombed-out shrines. Taxi drivers hung faded photos of brothers who had gone missing during the Tet Offensive. Everyone had a story, and almost none of them had a happy ending. Then came Tet. In 1968, during what was supposed to be a truce for the Lunar New Year. The Viet Cong launched a surprise attack. They hit cities all over the south, but Saigon got a front-row seat. Suddenly, the illusion shattered. Streets filled with gunfire. The American embassy, supposedly untouchable, was breached. Bullets flew through the walls of cafes and bookstores. The party was over. At least for a while. After Tet, the city never quite recovered. It limped forward, still glaring, still dangerous. But the cracks were too wide to ignore. For everyday people, survival meant blending in. Don't ask questions. Don't talk politics. Wear a clean shirt. Keep your head down. And if someone asks if you've seen anything, you haven't, ever. Because Saigon was full of people who knew how to vanish. Teachers by day, rebels by night, policemen who moonlighted as smugglers, a florist who ran a radio transmitter from the back of her shop. The woman who sells you fruit might be passing coded messages. The man fixing your bicycle might have set explosives the week before. Trust, a luxury, loyalty, a performance, fear, constant. And yet, Saigon still managed to dream. Students organized poetry readings. Artists painted what they couldn't say out loud. Old women brewed coffee like it was sacred. Lovers held hands by the river, pretending they had time, pretending the world wasn't falling apart all around them. But behind them, war marched on steadily, brutally, and as men vanished into the draft, onto battlefields, or into the jungle, the people holding their families together weren't always who you'd expect, because while the world talked about generals and politicians, it was often the women mothers, daughters, wives, who kept Vietnam running, one impossible day at a time. You're standing in front of a thatched home, staring at an empty doorway. He's gone, maybe to the north, maybe to the ARVN, maybe underground with the Viet Cong, or maybe he's just gone, swallowed by a patrol, a raid, or a bad decision made, under pressure. And now it's just you, and the kids, and the land. The war took men. It didn't matter which side. Husbands, brothers, fathers, they were pulled out of homes and dropped into uniforms. Volunteers, conscripts, defectors. And when they left, someone had to take over everything they used to do. That someone, more often than not, was a woman. She wasn't trained. She didn't ask for it. But she learned fast. Suddenly. She was the head of the family. She worked the fields. She bargained with traders. She repaired the roof. She handled the sick. And when night fell, she wrapped herself in silence, staring at a radio or a candle flame, wondering if he was still alive. But this wasn't just about survival. In many parts of Vietnam, women didn't just endure the war, they fought it. Some picked up rifles. Especially in the north, women joined guerrilla units. They were couriers, saboteurs, medics. Some carried grenades under their odai. Others crawled through the jungle with knives strapped to their legs, guiding units along paths they'd memorized since childhood. The Americans gave them a nickname, long-haired warriors. But to their villages, they were just daughters, mothers. These women weren't symbols. They weren't side characters. They were central in small towns and rural provinces. They handled everything from farming to funerals. They made decisions no one should have to make. When to run, when to hide, when to lie. If you had a baby crying during a patrol, and silence meant survival, you had to choose. Some women ran underground hospitals, dirt floor rooms lit by kerosene. No anesthesia, just herbal salves, cotton rags, and prayers. They stitched together wounded fighters, sometimes with sewing needles from their own homes. The stench of rot and iron never left their clothes. Others ran spy rings. Imagine a woman selling bananas at the market, laughing, chatting, harmless, but she's watching, listening. Every word said by a GI or a policeman gets filed away. That radio in her back room? It's not for music. It's for sending coded messages to fighters just beyond the tree line in the south. Some women worked both sides. One day they handed out bread to American soldiers. The next, they slipped rice into bags for the VC. Not because they were traitors, but because everyone was watching. You had to appease whoever was nearby. Survival required flexibility and a cold kind of genius. Mothers told bedtime stories that doubled as history lessons, but with new endings, depending on the side their children needed to believe in. Once upon a time, there was a brave soldier. Which soldier? Depends who's listening. Even the traditional roles got warped. A wedding could happen at dawn. No time for celebration, just a short ceremony, a bowl of rice wine, and a rushed goodbye before the groom disappeared into the mountains. Sometimes, the bride was already pregnant. Sometimes the groom never returned. Widows became common. So common, in fact, that entire support systems emerged around them. Widowhood wasn't just grief, it was administration. It meant navigating ration systems, burial rites, political suspicion, and sometimes harassment. You are now a woman alone, which made you strong, and also vulnerable. And if you think these women got thanked, think again. In the North, those who served were often honored in public, but lived with scars in private. In the South, they were sometimes vilified after the war ended, accused of aiding the wrong side, no matter what they'd endured. In both cases, silence became their inheritance, but they didn't stop. Some raised 6, 7 children alone. Some taught classes in half-destroyed schools. Some walked miles to gather wood because the jungles nearby were mined. They boiled water over scrap metal fires. They slept with knives under their pillows. They listened to the radio, not for music, but for names. Any name they recognized among the missing, the wounded, the dead. And still, they laughed. Not always, but sometimes, in the market, during festivals, or quietly with neighbors over tea brewed too weak to taste. They laughed because laughter reminded them they were still human, still here, and they waited for letters, for news, for the sound of boots returning down the path. Sometimes the men came back. Sometimes they didn't. Sometimes it was worse when they did, because they came back broken, confused, or accused. And it was the women who picked up the pieces. Again, they say war makes men into monsters or martyrs. But what it does to women, that's harder to explain. It turns them into steel wrapped in skin. Soft voices hiding absolute resolve. And sometimes they turn that steel outward. Because when you live in a world where the backyard can kill you, where every doorway might hide a trap, you learn to fight back. Even if it means becoming the very thing people fear. That leads us to one of the darkest realities of life during this war. Booby traps. Brutal, brilliant, and often built right in someone's backyard. You step outside your home, barefoot. The morning air is thick and still. It feels normal, too normal. You've walked this path to your neighbor's garden 100 times. And still, your eyes dart left, then right. Your ears strain for something, anything off. Because out here, something as small as a twig in the wrong place could mean you're about to lose a leg. In Vietnam, the war didn't need tanks to reach you. It came on foot. And more often than not, it was handmade, hidden, waiting. Booby traps weren't just military tactics. They were everywhere. They were personal. If you lived near a contested area, you learned real fast. Never trust the path. Never trust the trail. Never trust the ground under your house. Because someone may be the VC, maybe ARVN, maybe your cousin might have buried something there. And it was never marked. Think of how surreal that is. You have to live your life knowing your own backyard could be deadly. You send your kids to fetch water, and you worry not about snakes or the heat, but about bamboo spikes laced with dung, hidden under a thin layer of palm leaves. It happened all the time. Punji pits. Classic. Simple, brutal. A small hall filled with sharpened stakes, sometimes angled so that once a foot went in, it wouldn't come out clean. It didn't have to be deep, just deep enough. Sometimes they were camouflaged beneath rice husks. Sometimes they were just off the trail, waiting for someone to relieve themselves in the woods. And then there were grenade traps. A wire stretched across a doorway. A footstep in the wrong place, triggering a blast. You could be entering your own kitchen and not realize someone had rigged it overnight. Booby traps came in endless forms. A favorite? The Venus flytrap, a small bamboo box set to snap closed around a foot or calf, lined with metal shards. It wouldn't kill you. That wasn't the point. It would maim you, slow you down, force someone else to help. One injury could occupy 3 men. That was the math of war, and this wasn't just soldiers. Civilians were caught in these traps constantly. Farmers, children, even animals. Dogs, pigs, buffalo all lost to an invisible war you couldn't see, but were always walking through. But what made it worse was that no one really knew who said what. The Viet Cong used traps to level the playing field against better-equipped forces. The South Vietnamese did the same against suspected collaborators. And local villagers? Sometimes they set their own just to protect their crops or scare off bandits. It became impossible to tell who was defending and who was attacking. And that's how terror works best, when it's completely anonymous. Picture this. You're heading to visit your sister in the next village. A 15-minute walk. You step over a log. It creaks wrong. You freeze. A wire tightens beneath your heel. You don't breathe. You don't move. You just wait. Maybe someone hears your call for help. Maybe they don't. Maybe it's too late. In some places, whole paths were abandoned. People stopped using bridges because someone had wired the beams. Entire sections of jungle were declared no man's land, not because they were bombed, but because they were too quiet, too still. And everyone knew what that meant. American troops came in with minesweepers and long sticks, but even they missed things. Their dogs got tired. Their eyes played tricks. Some Gias said they'd rather take enemy fire than walk into jungle where every leaf might explode. It messes with your mind, makes every step feel like a death sentence. Some soldiers even started mimicking the traps out of desperation or spite. And civilians, caught in the middle, were the ones who paid the price. You hear about it in whispers. A mother carrying a jug of water who never made it back. A teacher walking home at dusk who never arrived. A child who went chasing a ball past the garden wall and didn't come back. And what do you do as a parent when that happens? You don't scream. You don't cry, not yet. You just start digging. Carefully. You remove debris with your bare hands, hoping there's still someone underneath. And then, maybe later, you scream. But the thing about booby traps is they're invisible until they're not. And by then, it's too late. Yet people still lived there, still planted, still cooked, still got married and had babies. Because what else could they do? Move? Where? Every village had its ghosts. Every field had its risks. The only difference was how loudly they screamed when stepped on. So you stay. You learn to walk lighter. You memorize every stone and crack in the trail. You teach your children what not to touch. You never fully relax, not even indoors. And still, sometimes something new shows up. A trap you've never seen before. Some cruel little invention no one warned you about, just to keep you guessing. Because that was the real genius of these things. They didn't just harm bodies. They broke minds. They made safety impossible. Peace impossible. Sleep impossible. But even in the most wired villages, where every gate was a gamble, people still held on to something. Religion, belief, ritual. Because when the land is trying to kill you, sometimes the only thing left to trust is the sky. And that takes us into the next chapter, where incense burned beside ruins. Monks gave blessings between bombings, and faith tried to hold together what war kept tearing apart. The temple bells still rang, even when mortar fell in the distance, even when smoke blackened the horizon, even when the monks had to sweep shrapnel from the courtyard before dawn prayers. In Vietnam, during the war, faith didn't vanish. It clung. You'd hear the chanting from far off, echoing through the hills, soft and rhythmic like a lullaby, humming against the sound of gunfire. It wasn't just ritual, it was resistance. Against madness. Against despair. Against the brutal logic of war. Vietnam was, and still is, a deeply spiritual place. Buddhism, Confucianism, Taoism, Christianity, they didn't just coexist. They entwined. Shrines to ancestors stood beside crucifixes. Incense curled around Virgin Mary statues. Prayers were whispered into riverbanks, forest winds, burning candles, and cracked cement walls. But when the war came, the gods didn't stay untouched. Temples were bombed. Not always intentionally, but bombs don't discriminate. A drone of planes overhead, a whistle, then silence, until the earth cracked open and swallowed sacred ground. Some monks rebuilt. Others simply prayed over the rubble and kept chanting dot in the south. Catholic churches dotted the towns, remnants of French colonialism. They became shelters. People packed into pews, not for mass, but to hide. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes the roof collapsed on them anyway, dot in the north. Churches were stripped. Religion was frowned upon by the communist regime, seeing as a distraction from the revolution. Many priests were arrested. Masses went underground. Entire congregations whispered, their faith like it was a secret. Some clung to Bibles hidden under floorboards. Others rewrote hymns into folk songs to sing without suspicion. Buddhist monks walked both sides of the war. Some remained neutral. Some weren't allowed to. Some stood between soldiers and protesters, hoping their presence could calm chaos. Others set themselves on fire. Yes, that image. You've seen it. June 1963. A Buddhist monk named Phich Kwang Jisi sat down in a Saigon intersection, poured gasoline over himself, lit a match, and didn't flinch. He burned in absolute stillness, making a statement no bullet could erase. The photo went around the world. And for many Vietnamese, it captured something deeper than politics. That the soul can scream louder than any gun. But the war kept testing that soul. Entire families were punished for religious affiliation. In some villages, Buddhists were accused of harboring communists. In others, Catholics were labeled traitors too. The revolution. Soldiers raided temples looking for radios. They searched pagodas for weapons. And sometimes they found them. Because faith didn't mean passivity. Some monks fought back dot in the countryside. Rebel monasteries trained young men, not just in meditation, but in sabotage. They believed resisting. Injustice was sacred. They blessed bullets. They dug tunnels. They quoted scripture with dynamite on their backs. To outsiders, it seemed contradictory. But in war, contradiction is survival. Meanwhile, civilians turned to faith like a tourniquet. A mother lighting incense after her son vanished. A farmer bowing to the altar before entering a mine-laced field. A child placing lotus petals on a goi, grave that didn't have a body. It didn't matter what the rituals meant anymore, only that they existed. Faith also bridged divides. In bombed-out cities, Christians and Buddhists often prayed side by side, not because they believed the same things, but because they lost the same people. The temple wall might be blown open. The crucifix might be scorched. But the prayers still rose upward. Even American soldiers noticed it. Some were moved. They took photos of monks in saffron robes walking through ruined towns. Others dismissed it as superstition. But deep down, even they knew when you're living. On borrowed time, you'll believe in something. Anything. Just to give shape to the chaos dot. And then there were the funerals dot sometimes. They happened in silence. A shallow grave. A whispered name. A string of beads left on a mound of dirt. Other times, there were processions, chants, drums, lanterns floating down rivers to guide spirits home. These rituals had been performed for centuries. The war tried to stop them, failed. Even among the ruins, faith refused to leave dot in Hanoi. Bomb shelters doubled as prayer rooms. In Hue, temples hid both orphans and rebels. In villages with no schools or hospitals left, the old priests and monks became the last elders teaching kids how to read, how to breathe. how to be still in a world that demanded motion and rage. But belief alone didn't protect anyone. There were stories. A monk accused of hiding supplies for the Vika disappeared. A nun seen talking to American soldiers arrested. A family with too many statues in their home watched. Even acts of compassion became suspicious. The war made kindness dangerous. And yet people still prayed. Before meals, after screams, in shelters, in rivers, beside the burned-out shells of their homes. Because when the bullets stopped flying, what else was there? But sometimes the sky answered those prayers, not with peace, but with thunder. Not with light, but with fire, because the war wasn't content with stealing the land or the people. It came for the sky next. And when that sky cracked open, it brought with it a horror no amount of prayer could hold back. It starts with a low hum so faint, you think it might be your own pulse. Then the sound deepens, rolls, grows teeth. A high whine cuts through the clouds. You look up. The sky doesn't look dangerous yet, but your gut knows. You run, because you've heard this before. And you know what comes next. The roar of jets, the whistle of falling metal, and then the world shakes. The sky opens up not with rain, but with fire, heat that scorches air, light that blinds through closed eyes. You throw yourself into a ditch, a trench, a hole too shallow to matter. You pray, and then it hits Operation Rolling Thunder, a name that sounds like a wrestling match. But for 3.5 years, from 1965 to 1968, it was a reign of death. A campaign of bombing so constant, so massive, that entire regions of North Vietnam simply ceased to exist. Villages flattened, forests burned to ash, bridges, roads, rivers, targets. And when those ran out, anything that looked like shelter got hit. The bombs came in all forms. Dumb bombs, cluster bombs, napalm, white phosphorus. You learned their names the hard way. The way they sounded, the way they smelled, the way they stuck. Napalm was the worst. It didn't explode, it spread. Sticky, flaming jelly that clung to skin, hair, clothes. You could be 50 feet from the blast and still end up running, screaming, burning. Water didn't stop it. Rolling made it worse. It laughed at pain. You saw children melt. Mothers cradle charred babies. Men stagger with half their face gone, not realizing it yet. And here's the worst part, it wasn't just in the North. The South got bombed too, accidentally, intentionally, randomly. Whole villages were suspected VC strongholds, and that was enough. One wrong informant, one blurred aerial photo, one bored pilot, and your entire life was reduced to a crater. And then came the B-52s, flying fortresses. Each one could carry up to 70,000 pounds of explosives. You couldn't even see them. They flew so high. But when they passed, you felt it. The shock waves cracked windows in cities 20 miles away. Bombs dropped in long lines, like punctuation from the gods. Locals called them ghost planes, because they appeared without warning and left nothing but death behind. Even the animals fled. Birds stopped nesting. Dogs barked nonstop. Ground itself felt sick. You'd be working in your garden and feel a tremor and instinctively hit the ground. Just in case, some areas were bombed so heavily, the topsoil vanished. Nothing grew back. Just sand, dust, silence, but people still lived there. In caves, in bomb shelters, in tunnels dug by hand. Schools moved underground. Hospitals became burrows. Families ate in darkness, slept in shifts. If you were lucky, someone had a hand-cranked radio to warn you when the bombers were coming. If not, you learned to read the wind. And it wasn't just the damage. It was the fear, the constant waiting. Will it be tonight? Will it be my house? My child? Some people stopped running. They'd hear the planes and just sit. Let it come. Exhaustion does. It hollows you out. And yet people resisted. Farmers planted again. Teachers reopened classrooms, sometimes in the ruins of the old ones. Children played in crater pools. Life bent, but didn't break. But the bombings changed people. They stopped trusting the sky. The sun used to mean warmth. Now it meant danger because clear skies made it easier to see targets. Rain was a blessing. Clouds were protection. People cheered for storms. And then there was the sound, the sonic boom of a passing jet, the thud of an explosion miles away, the buzz of a propeller overhead. These sounds became woven into daily life, like a second language. Even long after the war ended, people would duck at the sound of fireworks, or flinch at a car backfiring, because their bodies remembered. The landscape remembered too. Today, parts of Vietnam still carry scars from those years. Forests never regrew. Craters became ponds. Villages were rebuilt on top of bones. And children born decades later still ask what happened to the sky. And if you told them, they wouldn't believe it, because no one should have to believe that. The sky could hate them. But when the bombs stopped falling, something worse sometimes followed. Nothing. Crops burned, water poisoned, markets empty. And then the real hunger began, because when there's no food left, and your stomach turns against you, and you've sold everything that isn't nailed down, you have to turn to whatever's left, even if it means dealing with smugglers, even if it means stealing from neighbors, even if it means starving with your eyes wide open. And that's exactly where we're headed next. Hunger doesn't arrive like a soldier. It doesn't break down your door or fire warning shots. It slips in quietly. It waits. It makes your hands tremble as you tie your belt tighter, hoping to fool your body into feeling full. Then it makes your bones whistle in the wind. Then it makes you desperate. In wartime Vietnam, hunger wasn't rare. It was routine. It didn't care if you were North or South. It didn't care if you supported the revolution or prayed for the Americans to win. It didn't even care if you lived near a river or a rice paddy, because once the bombers came, or the soldiers passed through, or the rain didn't fall just right, your food was gone, and there wasn't always more coming. The markets were the first to change. Once you could find noodles, pork, shrimp paste, bananas, mangoes, sweet rice wrapped in banana leaves. After the war began, the stalls grew quieter. Vendors showed up later and left earlier. Some brought nothing. Others sold things so expensive, you'd laugh if you weren't starving. One egg might cost more than your entire day's wage. Meat became a myth. Rice, the very foundation of every Vietnamese meal, became currency. You weighed it like gold. A few grains dropped on the floor could start a fight, and even if you had money, it didn't mean you could eat. That's where the black market came in. Down narrow alleys, behind tarp-covered doors, people whispered about shipments coming from the docks, or from American mess halls, or smuggled in on military trucks. Everything had a price: canned peaches, army rations, even powdered milk. None of it legal. All of it necessary. To find the black market, you didn't ask directly. You hinted. You mentioned a cousin. You mentioned extra salt or that good fish sauce. If the vendor didn't shut down the conversation, you were in. And if you were desperate enough, you'd sell anything to buy food. Family heirlooms. Your last pair of sandals. A wedding ring. A bag of sugar was worth more than a bicycle. A tin of meat could get you a week's worth of favors. Sometimes people traded favors for food. Other times, they traded dignity. Even government-issued rations were unpredictable. In the North, families received coupons for essentials: rice, oil, salt. But if the shipment didn't come, you didn't eat. You didn't protest either. You just waited, or you found someone who knew someone. In the South, corruption ruled the system. Supplies meant for the poor often disappeared into the hands of soldiers or smugglers. Or they just vanished. Kids suffered the most. Mothers scraped burnt rice off the bottoms of pots, soaked it in hot water, and called it soup. Some added dried weeds to trick the body into feeling full. You'd see children with swollen bellies not from too much, but from not enough. And yet, they still played, still smiled. Hunger hadn't won yet. Rats became meals. So did frogs, snails, tree bark. Even clay was eaten in some regions. People called it earth cake. It didn't nourish, but it filled space. And in some cases, the war directly targeted food. Crops were destroyed on purpose. Agent Orange stripped the leaves off trees, killing forests and farmland alike. Irrigation systems were bombed. Rice. Fields were mined. Water buffalo were shot. Not always as military targets, sometimes just because hunger was another weapon. If you could make the other side starve, you could win. That was the logic, but you didn't need to be on a battlefield. To feel it. In cities like Hanoi, you'd see long lines for tiny sacks of rice. In Saigon, wealthy families ate imported French cheese while refugees outside their gates chewed boiled banana roots. On the coast, fishermen returned with nets full of jellyfish and empty promises. Inland, farmers worked harder for less half, their yield going to taxes or soldiers, the rest barely feeding their families. Some grew bitter. Why should I work the land if they're just going to take it? Others grew quiet. Better to be silent than to be noticed. Better to go hungry than to speak out. And some didn't survive. You'd walk past a house and realize no one had come out in days. No sound, no smoke from the cooking fire, just silence. Eventually someone would check, and usually they were too late. But even in that darkness, there were flickers of kindness. A neighbor would leave a handful of rice wrapped in a leaf outside someone's door. A vendor might slip an extra scoop into your bowl when no one was looking. A stranger might share a biscuit from an American sea ration, cracked in half with a smile, because hunger is cruel. But people, sometimes, are not. Still, the long-term damage couldn't be undone. Children born during the war often grew up stunted, weaker, smaller. Mothers, who went hungry during pregnancy, gave birth to babies who cried without sound. Bones that never hardened properly. Teeth that fell out too soon. And yet they kept going, because hunger, like the war, was a shadow that followed, but never quite caught those who kept moving. But some wounds didn't come from hunger. Some didn't come from bombs or bullets. Some were invisible, carried in the blood, passed down like a curse. Because when the war decided to kill the jungle, it didn't just kill trees. It killed futures, and that future had a name, Agent Orange. You didn't see it at first. Just a low-flying plane, silent in the heat, drifting like a dragonfly over the jungle. No explosions, no bullets, just a fine mist trailing behind it. Harmless, you thought, like smoke, like fog, until the trees started to die, until your skin started to itch, until your baby was born looking different. Agent Orange wasn't meant to target people. That's what they said. It was a defoliant, a chemical mixture designed to strip away the jungle that gave cover to Viet Cong fighters. Destroy the leaves, kill the camouflage. Force the war into the open. So they sprayed, and sprayed, and sprayed over 20 million gallons of it across Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. Between 1961 and 1971, the sky rained poison more often than water in some places. Forests that had stood for centuries turned to skeletal wastelands. Crops curled into blackened husks. Birds vanished. Rivers turned strange colors. And nothing grew back. But the jungle wasn't the only thing it touched. You lived near one of those spray zones. Maybe you didn't know it. You just noticed that the cassava stopped growing. The chickens got sick. Your brother's skin started blistering for no reason. Your grandmother coughed until she couldn't stand. The well water smelled metallic. You drank it anyway, because what else could you do? And then came the children, born too early, born too small, born without limbs, born with twisted spines or no eyes, or with faces that made even the midwives stop and whisper prayers. Some didn't live past a week. Some didn't make it to morning. Some lived, if you could call it that, screaming day and night, unable to hold food or silence. And no one could explain it. Not at first. They called it bad luck. They called it karma. They called it a mystery. But you knew. You remembered the plane. You remembered the mist dot. You remembered the name. GC Dacam. Agent Orange. The Americans said it wasn't toxic. Said it wasn't their fault. Said the science didn't prove anything. But what? Do you say to a mother holding her third dead baby in 3 years? What do you say to a boy whose skin sloughs off every time he walks under the sun? And it wasn't just civilians. Soldiers exposed to the chemical on both sides developed cancers, nervous system disorders, blindness, PTSD layered with physical collapse. Many of them were never told what they'd been exposed to. Some of them carried vials of the stuff on their belts without knowing what it could do. The damage wasn't short-term. It went deep, because Agent Orange contained dioxin, a chemical so potent it stays in soil for decades. It enters the food chain. It seeps into breast milk. It changes DNA. Children born now generations later still suffer from the effects of what happened then. And the land? In some places, nothing grows. The soil is cursed. Trees planted die within a year. Farmers dig trenches and hit patches of blackened earth that smell wrong. Animals refuse to graze. You can walk through certain areas in central Vietnam and still find the bones of trees poisoned 50 years ago. Still find families whose entire bloodline has been wrecked by one pass of one airplane. And yet, not everyone believes that there were trials. Hearings. American veterans pushing for recognition. Some received compensation. Others were denied. Vietnamese victims? Mostly ignored. Some got a one-time payment from foreign aid groups. Most got nothing but a quiet shrug from history. Still, they live. They adapt. They build wheelchairs from scrap. They create new rituals. They burn incense every year for the children who never lived long enough to be named. And some fight back. Not with weapons, but with gardens. Yes, gardens. Communities gather to replant poisoned soil, inch by inch. They use mushrooms that absorb toxins. They build greenhouses raised off the earth. They teach the next generation to tread carefully, to remember, but also to rebuild. Because forgetting isn't an option, but bitterness isn't a future either. Tourists visit these areas now. Some know the history. Others don't. They take pictures of the strange landscapes, the eerie silence where birds once sang. They walk past schools where half the students are in wheelchairs and wonder why. But if you ask the locals, they won't show you anger. They'll show you a tree stump that never grew back. They'll show you a photo of their brother who never came home. They'll show you a jar of dust-colored soil that used to grow papayas. And then they'll serve you tea, because in Vietnam, even pain is offered with hospitality. But if you think Agent Orange only affected the land, think again. Because during this war, there was another kind of transformation happening. One that wasn't about chemicals or bombs. One that blurred the line between farmer and fighter, mother and spy, neighbor and enemy. It happened quietly. It happened everywhere, and it turned ordinary people into double lives. Your hands are stained with dirt. You spent the morning planting sweet potatoes. Your shoulders ache from carrying firewood. You just want to eat, sleep, maybe tell your daughter a story if she doesn't ask about her father again. But the sun hasn't even set yet, and already there's a knock at the door. A coded knock. A knock you've come to fear as much as you respect. You answer. A boy, maybe 17, stands there. Dirt on his face. Calm eyes. He says nothing. Just hands you a slip of paper. You don't read it. You don't need to. You nod. You hide it under a loose floorboard. He's gone before your chickens stop squawking dot, and just like that, your other life begins. This is how it was for countless civilians in Vietnam, 2 lives. One public. One secret dot by day. You were a farmer, a shopkeeper, a school teacher. You smiled at your neighbors. You sold cabbage in the market. You told your kids not to play too close to the river. By night, you were something else entirely. A courier, a lookout, a medic, a code runner, a tunnel digger. You didn't volunteer. Not exactly. But when your cousin was taken, or when your house was searched for the 3rd time, or when a soldier kicked over your soup pot just to watch it spill, you made a choice. Not loud, not heroic, just a quiet agreement. And once you were in dot, it wasn't glamorous. There were no uniforms, no medals, just fear and rules. You learned to speak in gestures. A basket hanging from your window meant safe to enter. A lantern left burning past midnight meant they're watching me. A ribbon tied around a tree branch told someone, somewhere, move tonight. If you were caught, you denied everything. You never met that man, never saw that paper. The radio in your back room was for music, you swore. The stash of medical gauze under your bed, for your mother's leg. The map scratched into the underside. Of your rice bowl, just a crack. Some didn't survive the lie. Interrogations happened in rooms with no windows. Torture wasn't just beatings. It was the slow erosion of your reality. Being asked the same question 100 times. Being told your children were already dead, even if they weren't. Being shown a photograph that didn't exist and asked to explain it. Some broke. Others didn't. But no one came out untouched. You learned to live in 2 worlds at once. In one, you kept your fields tidy. You paid taxes. You greeted soldiers with respect. In the other, you passed coordinates and matchboxes. You memorized safe routes through the jungle. You helped wounded fighters hide in your barn dot, and sometimes it didn't even feel like betrayal. Sometimes the lines blurred. A South Vietnamese farmer might help the VC 1 week, then shelter an American medic the next. Not because of ideology, but because they were both just kids. Both wounded. Both scared. Even the most apolitical people eventually picked a side, or a side picked them. And the towns were worse, not in cities. Spies moved like shadows. The woman selling cigarettes on the corner? Maybe she was cataloging troop movements. The barber who chatted too much. Maybe his radio wasn't just for weather reports. The old man feeding pigeons in the square? Maybe he'd seen too much and was choosing silence. Whole communities lived like this, layers of loyalty and fear. Some families had members fighting on both sides, and no one spoke about it. A brother in the ARVN, a sister in the jungle. You celebrated Tet together in silence, pretending the world wasn't split in 2 dot. It wasn't just about politics. It was about survival. If you helped the wrong person, your house might burn. If you didn't help them, your child might disappear. You did what you had to. You folded laundry with a gun under the floor. You recited math tables to your son while checking the window every 30 seconds. And if someone found out, sometimes they didn't kill you. Sometimes they just marked you. A red X on your door. A rumor in the market. A sudden silence when you walked into the room. That's how you knew your secret was leaking out. Still, people kept doing it. Why? Because in a war like this, where the sky dropped fire, the ground held mines, and your future was a coin flip control was power, even a sliver of it, even if all you could do was carry a message, or deliver medicine, or say, "They're coming tonight." Sometimes that was enough, Dot. Sometimes it changed everything. Sometimes you saved a life, and sometimes someone saved you. But when life above ground became too risky, too visible, too loud, there was one place left to hide, Dot, below, Dot, because deep under the soil of Vietnam, an entire secret world was waiting, built by hand, lit by oil lamps, hidden so well that even the soldiers walking on top of it had no idea. And that's where we're going next. You're crouched underground, your head bent so low your chin brushes your knees. The air is thick, earthy, and hot, so hot you can barely breathe. You can't see much, just the glow of a dim oil lamp ahead, casting shadows that flicker like ghosts. Behind you, the tunnel stretches into darkness. In front of you, a child crawls forward on hands and knees, guiding you deeper into the earth. Dot welcomed the Siu Chi, or any one of the hundreds of tunnels just like it, an entire hidden city, beneath Vietnam's forests and villages, dug by hand, inch by inch, with shovels, pans, and sometimes just spoons. No machines, no blueprints, just dirt, sweat, and the urgent need to disappear. The tunnel systems weren't small rabbit holes. They were networks 3, sometimes 4, levels deep. The top layer for movement, the second for storage, the third for living. And if they went deeper, they became hospitals, kitchens, command centers, and even schools. A whole other life, beneath the feet of soldiers who never knew. It was there. The entrances were disguised with genius. A patch of moss, a clump of leaves, a termite mound that looked too perfect. The actual holes were tiny sometimes, just big enough for a child or a wiry guerrilla fighter to squeeze through. Americans called them black holes. They feared them, and rightly so, Dot, because inside, the Viet Cong thrived. You might imagine the tunnels as tight, filthy passages. And yes, they were. But they were also the arteries of a resistance movement. Messages traveled faster underground than they ever could above. Wounded soldiers were pulled from the jungle, treated, and returned to fight without ever being seen. Weapons were stockpiled. Booby traps were built. Meetings were held by candlelight with maps carved into dirt walls. Some tunnels had hidden wells. Some had secret chimneys that vented kitchen smoke through a dozen different openings, cooling it so it couldn't be seen by surveillance planes. It wasn't just survival, it was strategy, Dot, but life down here came at a price. Dot, first, the air. It never felt fresh. You breathed heat, mold, and the constant presence of other people's bodies huddled too close, whispering too low, always listening for footsteps above. Oxygen ran thin. CO2 built up. People fainted. Some didn't wake back. Up, Dot, then the creatures. Rats ruled the tunnels. Not little house mice, massive jungle rats. They followed the food, followed the people. Bit sleeping fighters. Fought over crumbs. Sometimes they gave away positions. You'd be hiding silently as a patrol walked overhead, and a rat would screech, run, and betray your presence. Snakes found their way in too. So did centipedes, spiders, and swarms of ants. You couldn't scream, couldn't swat. Just endure. Diseases spread, fast fungal infections from damp walls, respiratory problems, skin diseases. The deeper you lived, the harder it was to stay. Clean. Water had to be boiled. Bandages reused. And forget fresh air smoke from lamps and kitchens stayed trapped, coating lungs like tar, Dot, And yet, people lived here. Some spent weeks without coming up, others months. Children were born in tunnels. Elderly grandparents moved underground after their villages were destroyed. Some children had never even seen sunlight, only remembering it as a warm yellow smear through a ventilation shaft. You played silently, whispered jokes, learned your letters by tracing them into clay walls. You waited. Always waited dot and above. Soldiers searched. They brought dogs, flamethrowers, gas. If they found an entrance, they'd pour fuel down and light it, or toss grenades, or send in a tunnel rat, an American volunteer, who crawled into the darkness with nothing but a pistol and a flashlight. Many of those tunnel rats didn't come back. The Viet Cong booby trapped the tunnels themselves, dead ends rigged, with spikes, floors that gave way to pits, small chambers where soldiers would wait in the dark with a knife and no hesitation. It was claustrophobic warfare. One wrong turn, and you never came out. But even with the risk, people kept digging, kept hiding, kept fighting. And when the monsoons came, the tunnels flooded. People drowned in their own shelters. Walls collapsed. Supplies washed away. Still they rebuilt. The tunnel system was more than a physical refuge. It was a symbol. The Americans had helicopters, tanks, bombs. The North Vietnamese had the earth. And the earth never stopped giving. Sometimes you'd emerge from the tunnel at night, gasping for fresh air, covered in dirt, blinking under moonlight like it was too bright. You'd hear the sounds of distant shelling. You'd smell smoke. You'd feel hunger twist in your stomach. But you'd be alive, barely but alive. And you knew that underground, someone was still stirring rice over a low flame, still stitching wounds, still reading maps drawn in chalk and dirt, still believing that someday the world would flip right side up again. But while the tunnels protected, the sound above never stopped. One sound, more than any other, haunted every man, woman, and child in Vietnam, the thwack, thwack, thwack of helicopters. And that sound meant everything. You hear it before you see it. A distant thwack, 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 like a giant wooden heart beating in the sky. It echoes off the hills, bounces between trees, crawls into your chest. Sometimes it's one, sometimes it's a fleet, but the sound never changes. It always means the same thing. Something's coming, something fast, something deadly. Or maybe salvation. In Vietnam, helicopters weren't just machines. They were omens. For American troops, they were lifelines. They brought reinforcements, pulled the wounded out of hellholes, delivered mail from home, and carried out body bags. They called them Hueys, short for UH-1 utility helicopters, but nobody ever said the full name. Just Huey, like a friend, or a ghost. If you were a soldier pinned down in the jungle, hearing that thwack meant hope. A slick green dragon with open doors and machine guns mounted on either side. It might be coming for you, or it might be bringing more chaos. Because if you were a Vietnamese civilian, that sound could mean a dozen different things. None of them good. A patrol, a bombing run, a sweep through your village looking for VC suspects. Soldiers jumping out before you could even run. A helicopter circling your home like a vulture waiting to strike. You learned to drop everything when you heard it. Drop your basket, your shovel, your child. Anything that made you look suspicious, even if you weren't, because suspicion alone could get you shot or dragged away. Or worse, some villagers built shelters not just for bombs, but for helicopters. Trenches covered in palm fronds, tunnels near rice paddies. You didn't hide from them. You hid under them. And yet, some people ran toward the sound. Why? Because sometimes helicopters meant rescue. After a firefight, after a flood, after a family member was wounded. You might chase that sound through the mud, waving a blood-soaked rag, praying the door gunner would notice you. Sometimes they did. Sometimes they didn't. For children, the sound became a second language. You could hear a helicopter coming and know if it was low or high, friendly or hunting, landing or just passing through. You could tell from the rhythm, the pitch, the change in the wind, dot, and always your heart beat faster, dot. In cities like Saigon and Hue, the noise became background music. During lunch, during school, during funerals. It became so constant that people stopped looking up, just kept walking, kept talking, kept living. But when the helicopters hovered, when they paused in place, when they loomed, that's when you knew something was about to go very wrong. You'd see soldiers rappel down ropes into courtyards. You'd see snipers crouch at the doors, scanning windows. You'd see dust whip through streets, laundry torn from lines, market stalls overturned by wind, and panic, dot, then gone, just like that. The sound fading as fast as it came, leaving silence that felt heavier than the roar. But the real haunting came later, dot, at night. You'd dream of that noise. Even if you'd never seen a helicopter up close, you'd hear it in your sleep. Sometimes it was above you. Sometimes it was inside you, rattling your bones, making your teeth ache, your breath catch. A sound that didn't just echo, it stuck, and some people never unheard it. Long after the war, years after the last soldier left, old farmers would still pause when they heard a chopper fly overhead. Younger people might think they were just watching, but they weren't. They were remembering. And what they remembered wasn't just machines, dot. It was the faces at the doors, the boots on the rice fields, the way the blades chopped the air into panic, the way mothers screamed when the wind threw open their shutters and their children scattered like birds. Helicopters became symbols, dot, of strength, of fear, of foreignness, of control. They represented everything the war was: loud, fast, confusing, and impossible to ignore. There's a story, a real one, about the final days of the war in 1975, when Saigon was falling. Americans were evacuating by helicopter from the roof of the U.S. Embassy. Thousands of Vietnamese civilians lined the streets, begging to be taken. Only a few were. That image, those desperate hands reaching toward the sky, toward the chopper, that could lift them out of everything, is burned into history. Because it wasn't just about escape. It was about the sound. The last thwack of a war so many couldn't leave behind. But even as the helicopters faded from the skies, their shadows lingered. In the minds of those who survived. In the silence that came after dot. And for the survivors, silence was terrifying. Because it meant the bombs were done. The bullets had stopped, but the stomach still growled. The soil still bled. And worst of all, the war inside you, the part that didn't need guns, was just getting started. Now we turn to that uneasy silence, to the years when Vietnam tried to breathe again, when the war was over, but the struggle was not, when victory came, and it didn't look like what anyone expected. The war ends with a whisper, not a cheer. April 30th, 1975. The tanks roll through the gates of the presidential palace in Saigon. The South surrenders. North Vietnam declares victory. And just like that, after decades of colonial rule, civil war, foreign invasion, and years of hell, the fighting is over. Except it isn't. If you were there, standing in the street that day, watching the flags change and the soldiers celebrate, it didn't feel like triumph. It felt like something else. Something strange, heavy, muffled, dot, no fireworks, no parades, no flood of relief, dot, just silence. Because victory depends on where you were standing when the shooting stopped. For the North Vietnamese, it was the day of reunification. Years of sacrifice had finally paid off. They called it Liberation Day. Ho Chi Minh's dream fulfilled, the Americans gone. The puppet regime dissolved. The country finally whole again. But for the South, it was not liberation. It was collapse. Fear, confusion, and the start of something just as hard. In Saigon, now renamed Ho Chi Minh City, people scrambled. Those with connections to the old regime hid or fled. Some burned photographs, uniforms, family letters, anything that linked them to the South Vietnamese government or U.S. military. Others tried to blend in, hoping no one noticed who they'd been. They were rumors, mass executions, forced re-education, hard labor camps. No one knew what was coming. So they stayed quiet, heads down, eyes low. For many, the end of the war felt less like peace and more like waiting for the knock on the door, waiting for a name to be read out, waiting for someone to say it was safe, but knowing it might never be . And for the Northerners who moved south after the war, they were told they were coming to liberate, to rebuild. But what they found was a world unlike anything they'd been told. French architecture, Western clothes, people who didn't speak like them, eat like them, live like them. Tension brewed. In silence, suspicion ran deep. Families were divided, sometimes by politics, sometimes by geography. A brother who fought for the North might return home to find his family and fled to America. Or worse, they'd stayed and joined the South. Letters stopped coming. Photos were torn up. Entire histories erased. Meanwhile, the rural villages that had been battlegrounds for years finally fell quiet. But quiet doesn't mean healed. The bomb craters remained. So did the mines, the unexploded ordnance, the poisoned fields, the broken bodies, the fatherless children, the empty kitchens. Hunger. Always hunger. The economy was in ruins. Crops were ruined. Infrastructure shattered. Inflation spiraled. Food was scarce again. The black markets boomed. Again. Corruption slid back into place like it had never left. Rebuilding was supposed to come next. But rebuilding what? A country with two identities, two histories, two truths. The new government tried to unify everything. New laws, new flags, new slogans. But old wounds don't stitch up just because someone says they must. And then there were the camps. If you'd served in the ARV-UN, or worked with Americans, or were suspected of anything at all, you could be sent to a re-education camp. Not for a few days, for years. 10, 15. Some never came back. Inside, it was all about breaking you down. You farmed. You studied ideology. You confessed your crimes, real or imagined. You were told what to think, when to speak, who to be. You came out a different person. If you came out, families left behind had no say. No news. They waited. Again, and then came the silence of exile. Thousands of Vietnamese fled by boat. Rafts, fishing vessels, anything that floated. They sailed. Into storms, into pirates, into the unknown. Some made it. Some didn't. But every family left behind lost something when they left: connection, memory, identity. The ones who stayed, they endured. They swept the streets of bullet casings, rebuilt their homes, started businesses, went back to the rice, paddies, and pretended they didn't flinch when they heard helicopters in the distance. And yet, in that strange stillness, there were sparks. Children went back to school. Markets reopened. People got married. Births outnumbered funerals for the first time in years. Music returned. Not the old songs. New ones. Softer. Hungrier. Hopeful. Even if quietly so. Because even when you win a war, you don't get back the life you lost. There's no ceremony for rebuilding trust. No anthem for the friend who vanished. No monument for the life that could have been. So you plant your seeds again. You watch the rain. You hold your child tighter. And you try, without saying it, to believe that the next morning might not bring sirens. But even as Vietnam tried to heal, the world kept watching. And in dusty corners, quiet libraries, and whispered memories, people kept asking, what really happened here? What happened to the spies? To the soldiers? To the ones who vanished? Because in every war, some stories get buried deeper than the dead, and some secrets, they never stopped echoing through the trees. They say the war ended in 1975, but in villages across Vietnam, it still walks. Not in tanks or uniforms, but in footsteps behind you when no one's there. In whispered voices at the edge of the rice field. In cold drafts through open doorways. The war left ghosts, and they didn't leave with the soldiers. You grow up hearing the rules. Don't whistle at night. Don't point at the moon. Don't call someone by name after dark. These aren't just old superstitions. They're warnings. Because in Vietnam, the dead aren't always done with you. Too many bodies were never buried properly. Too many souls went unnamed. A fighter gunned down and buried where he fell. A child lost in the forest. A villager blown apart with no one left to mourn him. In Vietnamese tradition, the dead must be guided, honored, remembered. If they're not, they linger. You knew where not to walk. That grove where 3 brothers vanished? Avoid it. That hut where the fire never touched the altar? Leave it alone. That bomb crater in the jungle where bones still surface after storms? Don't talk about it. The living learn to live around the dead, and the signs were everywhere. Dogs barking at nothing. Children waking up screaming names they shouldn't know. A lantern that flickers no matter how many times you fix it. A soldier's photo falling from a wall on its own. These weren't coincidences. They were messages. Even skeptics got quiet when night fell. During and after the war, shamans and spirit mediums found themselves busier than ever. Families hired them to find missing bodies, to speak with sons who never returned, to apologize for what couldn't be fixed. I didn't mean to send you. I couldn't save you. I hope you can rest now. Some soldiers who survived the war didn't survive the silence after. They came back with eyes that saw too much, heard things that no one else could. Some swore they saw comrades walking through fields at dusk, calling them to follow. But they didn't follow, because they knew what it meant. Entire forests were considered haunted, not because of myths, but because people had heard things. Laughter with no mouths, screams with no source. A girl's voice in a tunnel that had collapsed decades ago. Even American soldiers reported strange things during their tours, equipment going haywire, shadows that didn't belong, footsteps behind patrols in areas marked as cleared. One story tells of a unit stationed near an abandoned village. Every night they heard music. Flute, soft, distant, beautiful. But every time they tried to find the source, it stopped. One morning, they found small handprints on their equipment. No children for miles. Another story comes from Siu Chi. A soldier claims he saw a woman in white walking into a tunnel entrance during a ceasefire. He followed. The tunnel was collapsed. No one had used it in years, but her footprints were there. Some said the jungle itself had memory, that it remembered blood, that it whispered names when the wind was still. And sometimes people answered after the war. Spiritual ceremonies were held all over Vietnam, not to celebrate, but to appease. Whole villages lit incense, made offerings, earned fake money, clothes, even scooters made of paper to send to the other world. Some families went to war zones with shamans, chanting to find the places where their sons had fallen. And in some homes, a place at the dinner table is still set for someone who never came home. Just in case, because you don't forget the dead, especially not the ones who died in terror, especially not when they still wonder. Even children born years after the war learned the rules. You don't mock the spirits. You don't talk about the war like it was a story. It wasn't a story. It was a story, but one still unfolding, still breathing. Some ghosts were metaphorical, sure. Trauma, regret, guilt, but others, you could feel them dot in the back of your neck, in a sudden chill. In a dream where a man with no face asks if you've seen his home. Even today, veterans return to Vietnam and feel something shift. They say it's nostalgia, or grief, or memory. But some confess to something stranger, a feeling that someone's watching them. Forgiveness isn't always loud, and not all ghosts want revenge. Some just want someone to remember them, to say their name, to light a stick of incense, to acknowledge that they existed. So that's what people do, even now. In modern cities, apartment buildings are built with floors skipped, lucky numbers chosen, altars placed in corners. Every action a quiet nod to the one still walking beside. U.S. Because war doesn't end when the guns fall silent. And in Vietnam, it doesn't end at all. It lingers, in soil, in bloodlines, in stories whispered to children before bed. And in that eerie quiet, where ghosts walk softly, the real scars of war come into focus. Not just the bodies buried beneath the earth, but the memories no one dares to bury. Next, we move away from the spirits of the past to the realities of the future, the scars you can see. Because some survivors didn't just carry memories. They carried burns, twisted limbs, empty sleeves, and lives that had to begin again with half the pieces missing. The war ends, but your body doesn't know it. You wake up every morning with pain that never left. Your leg bends the wrong way. Your arm stops at the elbow, even though you still feel the fingers. Ghost fingers, they itch, they burn. You try not to think about it. You sit up slowly. There's no rush. No job to go to. No uniform to wear anymore. Just the same wooden stool, the same tin bowl, the same rice that tastes like dust. You used to run through rice paddies. Now you shuffle, one crutch at a time. This is what life looked like for tens of thousands of wounded Vietnamese after the war. People who didn't die, but didn't walk away either. Survivors, but not whole. Landmine survivors were everywhere. Men, women, children. Farmers missing feet. Fishermen with no hands. Girls who never walked again because they stepped on the wrong trail one morning in 1969. You saw them in the markets, selling lottery tickets, polishing shoes, singing for coins, with voices full of pride and sadness, not begging, not quite, just there, reminders. But the scars weren't all physical. Some looked normal, perfectly healthy, until you saw their eyes. Eyes that didn't blink at sudden noises, that darted toward exits, that stared at the ground too long. PTSD wasn't a diagnosis then. No one had a name for it. They just said, he's different now. Or, she hasn't spoken since that day. Or, sometimes he walks out into the street and forgets where he is. The silence was heavier than the wounds. And there was shame. Because in the eyes of the new government, some of those who suffered weren't heroes. They were liabilities. Former ARVN soldiers injured in battle, now seen as traitors. Denied help, denied jobs, denied dignity. So they hid. You'd walk past a man with a limp and never know he once commanded a platoon. You'd see a woman with burns up her neck and not know her village was napalmed. No one asked, no one answered. That was the unspoken rule. Hospitals were overwhelmed. Medicine was scarce. Prosthetics, if they existed, were crude wooden, ill-fitting, painful. If you were lucky, you got one. If not, you made do. Wheelchairs. were built from scrap, crutches from bamboo. Some turned to alcohol, others to silence. Some turned their pain into art, music, poetry. Wounds turned into verses. Missing limbs became metaphors. If you couldn't walk, you could write. And yet, they endured. Mothers who lost legs still carried their children on their backs. Fathers with shattered spines taught their sons how to fish with lines tied to their stumps. Kids learned how to help without being asked, fetching water, cooking, bathing parents who couldn't lift themselves. There was no language of self-pity. Even in the cities, where the pace was faster, you saw the wounded adapting. A man with one arm selling newspapers. With the other, a blind veteran memorizing the rhythm of traffic to cross streets. A woman whose face had been burned so badly she could barely speak, selling incense outside a temple. Not no medals, no recognition, just life, just survival. And still, some were proud. Proud of what they did, of who they fought for. Even if they lost everything. They kept photographs hidden behind cupboard walls, faded letters wrapped in cloth, a dog tag buried in a garden for safekeeping. Their stories weren't told, but they were kept. Others let go. Too painful, too twisted, too confusing. Especially when the lines blurred, when your injuries came from people who now ran your country. Or when the war you fought for disappeared from history textbooks like it never happened. And then, as the years passed, they aged. Young soldiers. In the 60s and 70s, became old men hobbling through alleys with canes. Their scars faded, but never vanished. Their children grew up hearing half-truths. Their grandchildren asked why Grandpa walks funny. No one answered. And what about the ones who were still children when they were wounded? They became the hidden generation, disabled not by birth, but by bones. They learned to read from the floor of a hospital, to walk with twisted legs through fields that once betrayed them. Some never married. Others did and feared passing on. Their pain got, and yes, there were reunions. Old soldiers meeting again decades later. Quiet nods, awkward hugs, eyes full of memory and apology. They didn't talk about battles. They talked about families, weather, crops. Silence filled the rest. But every so often, someone would lift their sleeve, show the scar, and someone else would nod, knowing exactly what it meant. Because in the end, these wounds became a secret language, a map written in flesh, a story told without words. And while the country rebuilt around them, factories rising, roads paved, neon lights glowing, the wounded watched, slowly, from the edges, from wheelchairs, from behind carts full of bananas. They weren't part of the war stories in books, but they were the war's living memory, walking or limping through history. And while their bodies bore the proof, their minds carried the rest. But some, unable to speak about what happened, turned instead to something simpler, something human. They started over. New homes, new children, new rules, trying to build a life where none had existed before. In villages full of ghosts, on land that still held explosives, in towns where everyone remembered too much. And that's where we're going next, into the strange, fragile years of peacetime, where the dust settled, but the fear never quite did. You step outside in the morning and hear something unfamiliar. Nothing. No helicopters, no gunshots, no boots stomping down the road, just roosters, maybe a dog barking, wind in the banana trees. This is peace, but it doesn't feel like peace. Not yet. The war is over, but what's left doesn't look like a country. It looks like a bruise trying to remember what healthy skin feels like. In the countryside, the fields are coming back, but slowly. Farmers return to land that was once rice paddies, but now looks like the moon. Crater after crater after crater, some filled with water, Some still holding unexploded bombs. Some hiding bones. You plant anyway, because you have to eat. You drop the seeds with shaking hands. You pray you don't dig up a rusted shell. You teach your children where not to step. You never stop teaching them. The jungle tries to return too. The trees are shorter now. Some refuse to grow at all roots, poisoned by chemicals sprayed decades ago. Animals that once roamed freely are gone. Birds are quieter. The cicadas sing, but something in their rhythm sounds off. Like they're not sure it's safe yet. In towns, the rebuilding starts with the basics. Roofs, wells, roads, schools. But the buildings rise faster than trust. Neighbors who once fought on different sides still live next door. They nod politely. They trade sugar and salt. But no one brings up the war. It's better that way. Government slogans go up. Reunification is our strength. Forward together. Bright red banners. Big white letters. The people walk past them, nodding. But the trauma lives under their skin. You can't banner that away. In homes, old photos are hidden in drawers. Sometimes burned. Sometimes buried. One picture of a man in a South Vietnamese uniform could get your son denied a job. A letter from an uncle in California could make the police start asking questions. So families keep their stories inside, like locked boxes. Some villagers try to erase the past completely. New names for old places, cemeteries relocated, shrines destroyed or rebuilt with different symbols. A kind of national amnesia begins to take root. Forgetting becomes a way to survive, but not everyone forgets. Some collect shrapnel, like others collect coins. Bits of metal from fields, forests, and old roads. They keep them in jars, not as souvenirs, as evidence. Proof that it all happened, that they didn't imagine it, that the noise, the fire, the grief were real. And then there are the kids, born after the war, raised on silence. They hear the word war, but don't really know what it means. Just that adults go quiet when it comes up. Just that some people won't talk about certain years. Just that their father drinks too much and flinches in. His sleep. The new schools teach a version of history. Clean, simple. One side heroic, the other not mentioned. But the students walk past men with one leg, women with burns up their arms, temples with bullet holes. They know the truth is more complicated than their textbooks. In cities, the economy stutters back to life. Bicycles first, and mopeds, then years later, cars. Street vendors return. New businesses open tiny stalls with handwritten signs. People sell secondhand radios, knockoff jeans, American cigarettes brought in through unofficial channels. Black markets never really leave. They just change names. Families scrape together savings to send a child abroad. Maybe to France. Maybe to the U.S. One less mouth to feed. One more shot at the future. They pin their hopes to that person. Every letter, every dollar sent back, is treated like treasure. Like proof that the future is still possible. But it isn't easy. Inflation eats through salaries. Corruption snakes through every level of rebuilding. Bribes become normal. Fees for services that used to be free. People joke about it, laugh. But behind the laughter is exhaustion. And yet people endure. New music starts to rise. Love songs. Sad songs. Songs about starting over. They play on old radios and in tea shops, and in the background, you hear something. Remarkable. Laughter. Not loud, not frequent, but real. People marry. Babies are born. Markets fill with oranges and fish again. Incense drifts from doorways. Chickens chase children through alleyways. The small, stubborn rhythms of life return. But just outside of town, a sign stands nailed to a tree. Danger unexploded ordnance, and farther beyond that, a quiet graveyard. No names on most of the stones, just numbers, just years, just silence. Peace came. But it didn't come clean. It came with baggage, with memory, with bones under the floorboards. And those who lived through it, they kept moving forward, not because it was easy, but because standing still meant drowning. Still, the scars remained. And when you walked through the country, you saw them everywhere, not just on people, but in the land, in the language, in the habits. People couldn't break, ducking at loud sounds, locking doors in daylight, teaching their kids to stay quiet when soldiers pass. This wasn't the peace they imagined, but it was the only one they had. And just when it seemed like the war had finally gone quiet, it started creeping back in through films, foreign journalists, books, documentaries. People wanted to remember, but not always truthfully. And the question became, who gets to tell the story? You're watching a film in a dark theater. The actor on screen wears a green helmet, sweat dripping from his brow, gun slung across his chest. He's scared. He's angry. Explosions light up the jungle behind him. The audience holds its breath. It's a war film. Another one. A Jew sitting in the back row grew up in Vietnam. You know those trees? You know that river. And you know they didn't film this here. You know that face isn't Vietnamese. You know the voiceover forgot something. Something important. You. Because for years, the Vietnam War wasn't told by the people who lived through it. It was told about them. Through someone else's lens. First came the American movies. Apocalypse Now, Platoon, Full Metal Jacket, Grit and Gunpowder, all focused on one question. What did this war do to us? The Vietnamese were extras. Shadows in rice hats. Silent, exotic, blurry. Either victims or threats. Rarely human. Almost never named. The South Vietnamese soldiers? Absent? The northern fighters? Faceless? The villagers? Stereotypes. It became a genre war as spectacle. Helicopters. Napalm. Moral ambiguity. But for the people who actually lived it, it wasn't abstract. It wasn't metaphor. It was real, messy, and completely different from what played out on screen. Then came the documentaries. Grainy footage, interviews, voiceovers with soft piano music. A little more balanced, a little more history, but still mostly from the outside looking in. And in Vietnam, for a long time, the story was controlled. Official narratives, approved textbooks, celebrations of victory, warnings against forgetting the sacrifices of the revolution. Statues went up, songs were written, heroes declared, and some truths quietly buried. Families with Southern roots learned to stay quiet. Their versions of the war didn't fit the script. Children grew up with textbooks that told them how brave their ancestors were, but never how scared, how complex, how conflicted. There were no chapters about the girl who helped both sides. No footnotes about the boy who disappeared after asking the wrong question. And yet, people remembered anyway. Inside homes, the stories were different. Around kitchen tables, grandparents leaned in and whispered, "That's not what happened." They pulled out old letters. They pointed at faces in photographs with names erased from official records. Bit by bit, the hidden stories leaked out. In the 1990s and 2000s, a new generation of Vietnamese began writing books, filming interviews, painting what couldn't be said in words. They didn't shout. They didn't demand revision. They just told the truth, or their truth, at least. Stories of mothers who carried food to both armies, of fathers who never came home but left behind maps no one could read, of kids who survived bombings and then went to school the next day as if nothing happened. Then came the internet, forums, blogs, YouTube, people posting grainy photos, asking, Does anyone know who this is? Others replying, that's my uncle. He never came back. Suddenly, memory wasn't just personal. It was shared, connected. Global. Vietnamese refugees in America began writing their own versions of the war. Not with bitterness, but with longing. Longing for a country that no longer existed. For a version of home frozen in time. Some of those stories clashed. One side's freedom fighter was another side's invader. One person's sacrifice was another's loss. But even in the disagreement, there was something new. Voice. And voice is power. For the first time, people began to realize that there was no single Vietnam War. There were millions of Vietnam Wars. One for each family, each soldier, each village. And that's the challenge of remembering a war like this. It didn't happen in black and white. It happened in mud and fire, in sweat and whispered names, in stolen glances, hidden letters, and too many graves. So who tells the story? The official historians? The filmmakers? The veterans? Or the woman who still sets out an extra bowl of rice for her brother who never came back? Maybe it's all of them. Maybe none. Maybe the truth is scattered like shrapnel embedded in people, places, and memories. And the only way to understand it is to sit with it. All of it, the contradictions, the discomfort, the grief, the pride. Because memory doesn't march in a straight line. It limps. It circles. It waits for you to notice it. And now, people are noticing. New films are being made in Vietnamese, with Vietnamese voices, about Vietnamese lives. Not just soldiers, but midwives, poets, shoemakers, teenagers who dug tunnels, grandmothers who risked everything to protect a photograph. The story is shifting, growing fuller, messier, more human. And that's the only way it should be told. But while the world continues to reframe the war, one question still lingers in the silence between generations. How do you move forward when so much is still buried behind you? To answer that, we have to look at the aftermath, not through adults, but through the children who inherited the war without ever fighting in it. You're 10 years old. You've never heard a gunshot. You've never seen a soldier. But every adult around you walks like they're carrying something heavy, something invisible, something you're not supposed to ask about. Your textbook tells you one story. Your grandmother tells you another. And sometimes, your father doesn't tell you anything at all. He just stares at the horizon, not blinking, while the soup boils over on the stove. You're a child of peace. But your world is made of war. This was the strange reality for the children born in Vietnam after 1975. They didn't fight in the conflict. They didn't duck under tables when the sky roared. They didn't run from helicopters or sleep in tunnels. But they felt the war. In the silence, in the way their parents reacted to loud sounds, in the missing limbs of neighbors, in the way certain dates made the house too quiet. Some families talked about it. Some didn't. You'd ask, what happened to Uncle Hai? And your mother would pause for too long before saying, he left. But you'd heard the whispers. Uncle Hai was taken. For which side? No one said. No one dared. You'd find an old medal in a drawer and ask what it was for. Nothing. You'd find a photo of your father in a strange uniform. He'd say it was a costume. You knew it WASN single quotes T. In schools. The curriculum was clean. Reunification was good. Sacrifice was noble. Victory was complete. But when you went home, the stories cracked at the edges. Something didn't add up. Some kids grew up angry. Not because of the war, but because of what it had done to their parents. Fathers who never talked. Mothers who always seemed sad on certain days. Families that refused to visit certain towns. Siblings they never got to meet. Names only whispered when incense was lit. Others grew up haunted by stories of what they didn't know. There were rumors of re-education camps, of former officers selling fruit on street corners, of men who drank themselves into shadows. But none of it was written down. None of it taught. It passed through mouths, slowly, hesitantly, like a virus wrapped in caution. You knew better than to ask too many questions. But you kept wondering. And then came the children of the overseas Vietnamese, kids born in California, Paris, Sydney. Their parents fled the war on boats or planes or on foot. They grew up speaking Vietnamese with an accent, visiting temples in strip malls, hearing the war like a bedtime story gone wrong. For them, Vietnam was a ghost country, full of memory, but not home. They were taught to remember. Our side lost. We were betrayed. We survived Dot, and when they visited Vietnam years later, they found something strange. The people they met didn't match the stories they'd been told. They laughed. They welcomed. They asked questions. They shared beer and music and sadness. Some felt betrayed by the warmth. Some felt healed by it. Because the truth was, both inside Vietnam and beyond its borders, the children were dealing with the same thing: inheritance. Not of land or wealth, but of confusion. Trauma passed like a family heirloom. War wrapped in bedtime silences and memorial incense. Some tried to ignore it, but it always surfaced Dot in art, in film, in song lyrics they didn't understand until they were older, in the way they flinched when a family argument ended with someone storming out and no one calling them back. And slowly, some began to dig Dot to ask Dot to translate letters, to interview elders, to digitize crumbling photographs, to make podcasts, write books, paint murals, not to blame, not even to reconcile, just to understand. Because how can you build a future if you don't know what you came from? That question sparked a quiet revolution. A generation that didn't want to fight the war again, but didn't want to let it vanish either. They traveled back to the villages their parents fled. They visited tunnels, old camps, old battlefields now covered in weeds. They asked uncomfortable questions. They listened to uncomfortable answers. And some started bridging the gap between the North and South, between those who stayed and those who left, between the silence and the screaming. Not all succeeded. Some were rejected. Some found answers they wished they hadn't, but they tried. And that trying is its own kind of healing, because the war wasn't just about the people who fought it. It was about the people who had to live in its shadow, who had to carry its echoes, who had to guess what their parents meant when they said, "It wasn't always like this." And the more they listened, the more they realized something incredible. That pain, when told truthfully, doesn't divide Dot, it connects. One story at a time. But even as the children picked up the pieces, the landscape itself whispered of the past. Not in words, but in shapes. Because the earth remembers what we try to forget. Now, we'll walk through that memory through a land still shaped by war, decades later. You look out over a green valley. The sun is rising, the mist clinging low. From a distance, it looks beautiful, like nothing ever happened here. Birds call out across the fields. Farmers in conical hats walk narrow dikes between rice paddies. Water glistens. Life goes on, Dot, but then you notice something else. Dot, a crater, half filled with rainwater, sunken like a scar in the earth. A patch of forest where nothing grows right. Trees twisted, shorter, sickly. And over there, barely visible beneath the tall grass, a rusted metal fragment, curved and sharp, the last breath of a bomb that fell 50 years ago. This land remembers, even when people forget. All across Vietnam, the war left fingerprints, not just in museums or textbooks, but under your feet. The forests in central Vietnam still carry the wounds of defoliants, patches where the leaves never fully returned, where trees grow in slow motion, where the soil resists planting. The birdsong there is different. Thinner. You don't even realize. What's missing until the silence starts to feel too loud. The rivers hold memories too. Sediment choked with debris. Boats that once carried soldiers now rock quietly along the sea. Banks, half submerged, like ghosts taking a final breath. Children swim where gunboats once patrolled. Women wash clothes where corpses once floated past. The water carries it all, quietly, always downstream. And then there are the caves. During the war, people fled underground. Entire communities hid in limestone caverns, lit by candlelight and fear. Some of those caves are tourist attractions now carved. Stairways, placards, tour guides pointing out bullet holes in the rock. But deeper in, where no one goes, the smell of smoke still lingers. A smudge of soot on a ceiling. A ragged sandal left behind. Not everything has been reclaimed. In Quang Tri. Along the former DMZ, the land is still dangerous. Thousands of unexploded. Shells, mines, ordnance buried just inches below the surface. Some marked, some forgotten. Every year, even now, someone finds one with their foot, their plow, their bad luck. Entire teams work to clear them carefully, slowly, meter by meter. You might see them in the fields. Bright vests, metal detectors, flags marking places no one should step. It's been decades, and they're still finding things. They will be for years to come. In the cemeteries, rows of identical tombs. Some with names, some marked simply Lietses Martyr. Many contain bones that were never identified. Graves shared by brothers who died together and were buried together, their stories sealed in silence. You see incense sticks, faded flowers, and sometimes, oddly, a can of beer or a cigarette. An offering, a memory. But not all graves are official. Villagers whisper about hills where bodies were left during battles, fields that were too dangerous to cross afterward, forests that grew over the fallen. There are places no one plants, not because of superstition, but because they know. They just know. Roads follow old supply lines. A paved highway might trace the same path as the Ho Chi Minh Trail, once used to transport soldiers, weapons, and food under a canopy of leaves, so thick it hid whole divisions from aerial surveillance. Now, trucks roll through, scooters, tourists, but sometimes locals still call it by its wartime name. In some towns, you'll see buildings with strange scars, bullet holes, impact marks, reinforced basements. They've been repainted, remodeled, but not erased. No one bothers to cover them up anymore. The past doesn't need hiding. It needs witnessing. Even the mountains bear names that weren't theirs before. In War Hill 937, better known as Hamburger Hill. Not for anything native to Vietnam, but because of what happened there. Because of what people became there. Those hills still exist. Still cast long shadows when the sun dips low. And then there are the sounds. In the quietest places. When the wind is just right, locals say you can hear it something in the distance. Not voices, not music, a kind of hum, a vibration. Like the air is remembering the time it was ripped apart by bombs. Even the animals remember. There are villages where birds no longer nest, where the frogs fell silent after a nearby spraying, where cattle avoid certain stretches of ground as if they sense something buried that we can't see. And the jungle? The jungle came back. Of course it did. It always does. But it came back. Different. In some places, it's thick and wild again, impenetrable. In others, it's stunted, hesitant, like it's still holding its breath. People live among these remnants as though they're normal. And for them, they are. They build homes beside craters, schools atop old battlefields, shops where tanks once rolled through. Life grows out of rubble. That's what it does. But when you walk through Vietnam today, if you know where to look, you'll see it. The past isn't gone. It's just quiet, tucked into corners, hidden beneath weeds, floating in rice paddies, echoing through empty airfields. A landscape that absorbed the war like a sponge and never wrung it out. But in that quiet, something else grows too. Memory. Not as a weapon, but as a seed, planted in soil that once knew only fire. And from that seed, a question rises: what do we owe to memory? Because remembering isn't just about the past. It's about what kind of future we build with it. And that future starts with the stories we choose to pass on. You're sitting cross-legged on the cool tile floor. An old woman, your grandmother, leans forward, her voice low, her eyes half closed, as if she's watching the scene in her mind more than telling it. Her words move slowly, gently, carefully. Not because she's old, but because the story is fragile, Dot, and so are you. She tells you about a night when the sky caught fire, about a boy she once loved who never came back from the jungle, about hiding in the clay jar behind the kitchen when soldiers kicked in the door. You don't ask questions. You just listen. Because this is not a story that's been told often, or maybe ever. This is how history survives in Vietnam, not through official records, not through polished monuments, but through people, through whispers, through family, through stories passed down like recipes, worn and altered, but still alive. Every generation inherits a version of the war. Some grow up believing in glory. Some inherit silence. Some receive boxes of old letters wrapped in string. Some receive only absences, empty chairs at family gatherings, names mentioned only once, photos missing from albums. Dot, and the question becomes, what do you do with what you're given? Some write it down. Others paint it. Some never speak it, but you see it in their choices, in how they raise their children, how they flinch at loud noises, how they visit certain graves every year without ever explaining why. Dot, in recent years, there's been a quiet flood of books, memoirs, and oral histories in Vietnam, not from generals or politicians, but from the ordinary people who lived through the war. Rice farmers, teachers, nurses, mechanics, monks, people whose stories were too messy, too small, too human for the official narrative. One woman tells of carrying messages in her odi, her heart pounding as she passed checkpoints. One man remembers building coffins out of scrap wood while American planes roared overhead. A grandmother speaks of raising 5 children in a bomb shelter, feeding them broth made from oiled leaves. None of these stories are big, but they are everything, because they remind us that war isn't just about battlefields. It's about kitchens, about lullabies, about hiding your best pair of shoes in the floorboards and hoping you'll live long enough to wear them again. And the children of these storytellers, they're listening, maybe more now than ever. They're recording, translating, publishing, some in Vietnamese, some in English, some in both. They're trying to make sense of what they inherited, and they're not alone. The children of American veterans are doing the same. So are the children of refugees. So are the children of people who never fought but lived. And that, too, was a kind of battle. Dot, together, they're building a mosaic out of contradictions. Yes, the war was political, but it was also personal. Dot. Yes, there were heroes, but most people were just scared. Dot. Yes, there was suffering, but there was joy too. Weddings, jokes, music played quietly by candlelight, hands held in the dark. Dot. This complexity doesn't weaken the story. It strengthens it, because when a generation can say, we survived this, and we still chose to love, to rebuild, to remember, that's power. That's legacy. Dot. And memory doesn't need to be neat. It just needs to be true. Dot. Still, there's a risk. Dot. As the witnesses grow older, as their voices get quieter, as their stories begin to fade. What happens if no one's listening? What happens if we let the past slip away Because it's inconvenient, or uncomfortable, or too full of wounds. That's why the act of telling, of repeating, of writing, of listening isn't just cultural. It's sacred because memory, like land, can be lost. But it can also be reclaimed. And in Vietnam today, there's a growing recognition that remembering doesn't have to mean reopening wounds. It can mean planting markers. It can mean laying down stones so the next generation doesn't lose the path. And so the stories go on. A teacher assigns her students to interview their grandparents. A son digitizes his father's war diary. A museum opens in a village once shelled to dust. An old man writes his name next to a photograph on a wall. And finally says, "That was me." The stories are out there. Everywhere. In back alleys and mountain huts. In crowded cities and quiet fishing towns. In the eyes of people who still wait for letters. In the songs people hum without realizing why. And you're part of it now, because listening is remembering. And remembering is how we make sure the war ends not just in maps, but in hearts. But there's still one final story to tell. The story of what Vietnam became, not just in scars, but in strength. Not just in memory, but in movement. Not just in the past, but in what it built next. Because after all the ashes, the silence, the ghosts, and the grief, what rose from the rubble was something no one expected. Hope. You walk through Ho Chi Minh City and hear laughter. Real laughter. Not nervous, not weary. Kids chasing one another through alleyways. Teenagers blasting music from scooters. Grandparents sitting on plastic stools playing checkers with the kind. A focus only peace can afford. If you didn't know the history, you might not believe this place ever burned. But it did. Over and over. And yet here, it is. Vietnam today is not a country trapped in the past. It remembers, yes. But it moves. It hums. It grows. It turned rice paddies into tech parks, bomb craters into swimming holes, and old war tunnels into living. Museums with school kids laughing on field trips. It didn't erase the past. It built on top of it. Walk through Hanoi, and you'll see it too. Street vendors frying banzio next to colonial buildings. Couples taking wedding photos outside the old prison walls. A temple shadowed by a high rise. A city where centuries sit side by side. But it wasn't easy. The years after the war were hard. Reunification brought challenges no bullet could solve. Economic collapse. International isolation. The scars of ideology and bureaucracy slowed recovery. For a time, the country stood still remembering, but unable to move. And then, something shifted. In the late 1980s, GI was introduced. A sweeping set of economic reforms that opened Vietnam's doors to the world. Markets liberalized. Private enterprise returned. Farmers were allowed to sell their crops again. Streets once quiet with fear began to bustle. It wasn't a straight line. There were missteps. There still are. But it was a turning point. People stopped talking about surviving. They started talking about thriving. And now, Vietnam is one of the fastest growing economies in Southeast Asia. Its cities are electric. Its countryside vibrant. Its people resilient in a way that doesn't need to be spoken. It's simply understood. And they didn't forget the past. They just didn't get stuck in it. Children now visit the War Remnants Museum on school trips. They see the photos, the wreckage, the aftermath. And then they step outside into streets filled with life. And they understand. This is where we came from. But it's not where we're going. Because history is not a prison. It's a compass. And the Vietnamese people have used that compass with a kind of quiet brilliance. They still hold ceremonies. Still burn incense for the dead. Still tend to the graves of soldiers whose names they never knew. But they also invest, innovate, travel, dream. There are businesses, now run by children of refugees and children of revolutionaries, side by side, no longer enemies. Some never ask which side your father fought on. Others still whisper it late, at night. But it no longer defines the future. In cafes across Saigon, you'll find young people debating philosophy, building apps, editing videos, running global brands from plastic stools with WI-Fi. And across from them, veterans playing chess, watching, smiling, not because everything is fixed, but because they never thought they'd see this. This wasn't the victory they were promised. It was something better. Peace. Not the kind politicians declare with handshakes and documents. The kind built by grandmothers teaching their grandchildren how to cook, by fathers walking to work without fear, by mothers who no longer wake up at the sound of helicopters. This is the peace born from endurance, from memory, from choosing again and again to keep building. And through it all, the land watches. The rivers run clear again. The rice grows. The jungles hum. Some places are still dangerous. Some places still hold bones. But most of it breathes. It lives. Might meet a child playing beside a rusted tank now covered in moss. He doesn't know what it is. Not yet, but one day someone will tell him. And maybe he'll ask questions. Or maybe he'll run off laughing, chasing a dragonfly into the trees. Either way, that's the miracle. That from a war that swallowed millions, something this full of life could emerge. It doesn't erase the pain. It doesn't undo the dead. But it gives meaning to what they endured. Because if war is what breaks us, peace is what we build when we choose not to stay broken. Vietnam chose that. And the world is just beginning to understand what that choice meant. But before we leave this story behind, before we step fully back into the present, there's one last thing to understand. Not the soldiers, not the battles, not even the victory, but the quietest legacy of all, sleep, the first peaceful sleep in years. It happens slowly. First, the night becomes quiet again. Not quiet like fear, quiet like calm, like absence. Like a wound that's no longer bleeding. You don't hear bombs anymore. Or boots. Or the clatter of metal against cement. Just frogs. Cicadas. Wind sliding through bamboo. Then your body adjusts. You stop flinching when the neighbor slams a door. You stop holding your breath when a motorcycle backfires. You stop checking the sky for helicopters before you hang laundry on the roof. And then, one night, without noticing, you sleep through until morning. That's the kind of victory no government can declare. The kind that happens one village at a time. One bed, one breath. The people of Vietnam, those who lived through the worst, often said the thing they missed most wasn't peace or safety or freedom. It was rest, real rest, not closing your eyes in a trench, not dozing with a rifle nearby, but sleep without fear, sleep that trusts the morning will still be there. It didn't come easy. For years after the war, people woke up drenched in sweat, convinced they'd heard something. A shell, a scream, a knock. Some nights they didn't sleep at all. They just sat, listening to the dark, waiting for something to start again. Because even when the war ended, the body remembered. Children born after the war watched their parents sleep with clenched fists. Mothers who used to cradle crying babies through shellfire now jolted awake at every cough. Fathers dreamed of places they never wanted to return to. Places with names like Ki San, AP Back, and Dien Bien Phu. Sleep became precious, sacred, reclaimed. People rebuilt bedrooms the way they rebuilt houses, slowly, carefully. New mats, new mosquito nets, soft pillows made from rice husks, candles lit before bedtime. Incense burned not just for the ancestors, but for peace of mind. Some turned to prayer, others to storytelling. grandparents began telling old legends. Again, not war stories, but the ancient tales from before. The turtle that carried the sword, the dragon that founded Hanoi. Gentle stories. Sleepy stories. Stories that reminded children and adults that not every ending is tragic. Villages took back the night. No more curfews. No more blackouts. Radios played lullabies again. Not propaganda, not news. Just music. Soft, simple. Meant for dreaming. And in that dreaming, something new took root. Children started imagining futures instead of hiding from them. Futures with schools that weren't rubble, with parents who stayed, with land that didn't explode underfoot. Sleep became the first step toward those futures. Because when people sleep well, they wake with strength. They rebuild faster, love easier, forgive more. Sleep is how the body repairs itself. And Vietnam battered, burned, battered again finally, quietly, began to heal. That healing took many shapes. In the North, families who'd lost everything began to grow things again, not just rice, but lotus, sugarcane, hope. In the South, broken city blocks became neighborhoods again. Children played, grandmothers gossiped. Someone opened a noodle stall with money saved in a teacup. And all of it required sleep. Not just the act of sleeping, but the permission to sleep. The feeling that it's okay now, that no one's coming, that the past is past. That morning is something you can count on. So if you ever visit Vietnam and you walk through a small town at night, listen carefully. You'll hear it. Not the silence of fear, but the rhythm of breathing. Doors creaking open in the morning. The splash of water being poured for tea. The rustle of trees brushing against rooftops. A country that once spent decades holding its breath now exhales. Slowly, gratefully. Not every scar is gone. Not every story is told, but the war no longer owns the night. And that, maybe more than anything else, is how you know peace has arrived. Because sleep real, uninterrupted, fearless sleep isn't a luxury. It's proof that you've survived. So now, with the noise faded and the dust settled, you lie back and let the stillness wrap around you. You've walked the rice fields, ducked through tunnels, listened to the whispers that never made it into history books. You felt the weight of a war that didn't end when the guns fell silent, a war that lingered in footpaths, in family, names in the taste of burned rice. And maybe, for a moment, you felt it too, the confusion, the fear, the silence that followed, the odd, restless peace. But here's the thing. The story of Vietnam isn't a tragedy. It's a survival. It's the story of a place split open, flooded with fire, and then stitched together again by the very people who suffered through it. Not just soldiers, not just generals, but mothers with missing sons, fathers with lost fields, children who inherited memories like bruises. They didn't choose the war, but they chose what came after. And what came after was not loud. It wasn't easy, but it was theirs. Now, as the night deepens and your eyes grow heavier, remember that this wasn't just a lesson in history. It was a reminder of how fragile peace is, how hard-fought rest can be, how even in the worst of places, people find ways to laugh, to build, to sing, to sleep. So let this be your own small pause, your moment of quiet in a world still too noisy. Because if Vietnam can sleep now, after all that, it means there's hope for all of us. Sweet dreams.